So let me pass you over to what I'm sure is a familiar face to many of you, and that's Marta Messa, who is Slow Food Secretary General. So Marta, talk us through this new policy position paper. What are the kind of key take-home messages from this brief?
Thank you so much, Natasha, and hello, everyone. Very nice to see you, or soon see you towards the end when you turn on your videos. Yes, so we're very excited to launch this new policy brief today. It builds on work that we've done in the last couple of years with other partner organizations on trade. And basically, the whole purpose of this is really how can we look at trade as a lever to change food systems for the better? How can we make food systems better? So all in all, this policy brief is basically looking at some of the unsustainable aspects of the current global food system and how EU trade is enabling that, and then making policy recommendations. So just to give you a few, messages about these on the content of the report. The first part really looks at basically how EU trade is enabling global food systems that feed profits for a few and hunger for many. Basically, what we're looking at is that global food systems that are based on the industrialization of agriculture, so the industrialization that has led to higher yields, but has not led to the solution to to solving world hunger. To the contrary, we have 1/3 of the food produced for human consumption waste on a global scale, and hunger is skyrocketing, and so is malnutrition. And in turn, these global food systems destroy biodiversity, feed the climate crisis, and exploit natural and human resources. In turn, if globalization is based on industrialization is in turn based on monocultures and factory farming that are basically betting on an ever narrower genetic pool of resources, whether it's breeds or varieties that we're cultivating for human consumption, making us all and the global food system vulnerable basically to simple bugs that can totally disrupt the whole global production and supply. And not only that, but industrialization, unfortunately, is often based also on the disrespect for the farmers, the farm workers, and animals. And ultimately, industrialization is basically based on the externalization of the negative aspects, whether it's pollution or indeed social rights and so on. And basically, EU trade goes in the same direction. We see it in later on, but essentially, EU trade is externalizing the negative externalities to other countries, while trying to, make some headway here in terms of sustainability. And this externalization is, amounts to the FAO estimated about $12.7 trillion in 2020, whether it's in terms of pollution, social costs, the health crisis. And really, this is about industrialization causing irreparable damage, whether it's about biodiversity loss, the climate crisis, and really all the way to undermining not only the well-being, but in some cases, the life of the communities on the ground. Slow Food as a global movement works with communities all around the world in 160 countries worldwide. And over time, we've been meeting with communities that were testifying to the terrible impact of monocultures grown, for instance, in terms of cultivating GMOs using pesticides, banned in Europe, but exported by Europe elsewhere, and used, really leading to tremendous health effects and death of individuals in local communities. So another thing that we look into the report is who's championing this model. And this is basically a few monopolies that really have the main control over the whole food system, from the seeds to the production to the distribution. And at the same time, they have a lot of sway over policies. The same policies that in Europe as well as globally have favored these big players in the food system. And for instance, this has led in Europe over the last 15 years to the disappearance of about 5.3 million farms, with, of course, terrible effects for all our production system. And all of this also means that this market concentration limits the choice of farmers and the choice of consumers, and ultimately the resilience of our global and local food systems. Still looking at what EU trade is basically enabling now, what it is based on, it's based on the commodification of food. So food is treated as a commodity, and the value is measured in terms of financial profitability rather than nutrition or ecosystem services, let alone cultural value. And because it's considered a speculative asset, the speculation, it is being speculated, and this leads to volatility of prices.
Yeah,
Guess
danke.
what? that guess what is basically again impacting negatively on farmers and consumers. So all of this to say, trade policies need to be reformed. So we looked specifically in what EU trade policies can do, and we looked at 3 levers, essentially that are within reach, that we can really work on right away at European level, and that will have an effect globally. This is, in a nutshell, the implementation of mirror measures, and I'll say in a moment what these are, supporting the transition to agroecology, and rebalancing power in food systems. So when it comes to
Und
mirror
um
measures,
ein Gleichgewicht. Was die
basically
Maßnahmen
there are
angeht,
provisions
das
integrated
sind
into EU legislation
Bestimmungen, die in der
in many
EU-Legislation verankert
aspects
werden müssen,
import
die
foodstuffs in EU
Zugriff
markets,
geben
promotion
auf
on
neue
things like
Märkte und
environmental,
das
social
abhängt
justice,
von
humanitarian
den
standards
gleichen
and labor
Standards.
laws.
Also
Because today the situation is that food imported into Europe can be grown with toxic pesticides that are banned here in Europe, under labor conditions that we would never allow here in Europe, even though Europe is not a saint itself, to be honest, on some of these things either, with no regard for sustainability. Just to give you an example, and I think my colleague John will go deeper into that, just in 2018, European countries exported over 81,000 tons of pesticides, containing 41 substances prohibited in the EU. So like that's a nonsense, that's hypocrisy. Like we're banning things here because they're bad for the environment and bad for people, but we produce them, sell them to third countries and re-import the same products. So harming communities elsewhere and harming individuals
On va
also.
aussi voir les résultats, les importations qui vont revenir nous avec l'impact sur la...
Son básicamente medidas al respecto, reformas, y es para el beneficio de todos. No se trata
protectionism of farmers in the EU. It's about respecting what also farmers are doing and the work that farmers are doing elsewhere. When it comes to the second lever of change, supporting the transition to agroecology, also looking at transition away from industrial farming and animal factory farming. So that is based really on considering animals as livestock, as productive units that are not sentient beings. And indeed, for instance, the EU imports massive amounts of soy and other feed crops that are basically cultivated. Often these are GMO cultivations with high use of glyphosate and other pesticides and fertilizers, and that are often coming from regions where deforestation has happened and displacement of local communities has happened for this production to happen. So that we have this crop being produced not for human consumption, but for
C'est pas
cattle,
pour la consommation humaine, mais pour les bétails dans les usines en Europe. Et tout ça, c'est faire en sorte que les produits sont moins chers, mais il y a cette externalisation dont j'ai parlé avant.
Support a transition to agroecology in Europe and abroad, strengthen animal welfare, and promote plant-rich diets. And when it comes to the rebalancing power in food systems, we're really talking about strengthening corporate accountability and supply chain transparency, empowering local food actors and short supply chains or local markets. And I'm really happy to have Nick from IPES-Food looking into that later, and protect food sovereignty and cultural food heritage. So really food as something that is not at all a commodity, but is a right. And it's so much, it has so much to do with who we are and how we relate to one another. So to conclude, what the report is basically saying is we're in a very, as you said, Natasha, interesting moment, if you want to say it that way. But basically with the climate shocks happening, the trade wars, and literally the wars unfolding, and the whole volatility taking off, the EU decision makers are at a crossroads. Either reinforce the trade model as it is, or change route towards much more sustainable food systems that feed communities and people and not faraway markets. And in that way, lead really the way in Europe, and in a way support also globally the transition to more sustainable food systems.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Marta. Perfectly in time as well. So thank you. Let me just push a little bit on that last point. You spoke about, the EU being at this crossroads, EU decision makers, and as we're sat here in Brussels, maybe we can push on this policy point. One of the big shifts and the big responses to this turbulence that you've spoken about has been this shift towards competitiveness, right? That's the new name of the game in the EU, in Brussels. And this is really translating it as the need to bolster global trade. It's kind of going the opposite direction. So can we talk a little bit how Slow Food's vision of the trade reform fits into this competitiveness agenda? Is this compatible, and how can we, maybe we need to reframe this idea of competitiveness. Can you speak to that point?
Yes, absolutely. And I think indeed the keyword is reframing competitiveness, because as Slow Food, we've been working for the last 30 to 40 years on food biodiversity. So the biodiversity of, as I was mentioned before, breeds, so of animals that we grow in agriculture, that we farm in agriculture, but also the biodiversity of varieties that we cultivate that has been shrinking terribly. Both have been shrinking terribly in terms of also the data that the FAO is providing, but also the biodiversity of knowledge that goes hand in hand with food production, the biodiversity of transformed food products that exist out there. And the industrialization has led to narrowing down, as I was saying, of how many products we rely on. And the competitiveness that is being so much talked about is basically a competitiveness of the race to the bottom. Who can offer the highest quantity for the lowest price? And that continues being a race to the bottom for everyone. As Slow Food, we're not against per se the concept of competitiveness, but it's about reframing it. Biodiversity is what makes local products unique. And in that sense, if you want to use the term competitiveness, competitive, because there is nowhere else you're going to find, a raw milk cheese grown, we're here indeed in Belgium, as you said, Natasha, but grown in the Wallonian part of Belgium, like based on a traditional recipe. You're not going to find it anywhere else. There is no way that competes, in terms of price with others. It can compete in terms of quality. And that's where we think we really need to reframe competitiveness in terms of looking at the quality of the diversity of productions, which then really means the diversity of knowledge and know-how and the economies and actors involved in the food system, and not this narrow, concentration of power in the hands really of a few multinationals working on a handful of crops.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Marta. And there'll be time at the end. If you have any more questions for Marta about the policy brief, don't worry, she's not going anywhere. But we will now pass to our next speaker. So thank you, Marta. We're now going to hear from John Kariuki, who is a coordinator with Slow Food Kenya. He's going to give us a bit the on-the-ground perspective, especially focusing on this idea of pesticide dumping, trade injustices, and the impact these have on farmers in Kenya more widely in the global south. So John, let me pass you the floor.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. So my name is John Kariuki. I work with Slow Food Kenya as the country coordinator. And I'll be sharing about pesticide dumping and trade injustices in Kenya. But of course, I have decided to choose Kenya as an example because, of course, whatever happens in Kenya cuts across several sub-Saharan African countries. So before diving into the topic of pesticides, I would like to give you an overview of the agriculture sector in Kenya and the role that agriculture plays in the country. Next, please. So agriculture is the most important sector in Kenya, and it contributes 33% to the GDP and 27% indirectly through linkages with other sectors. The sector employs around 40% of the total population and over 70% of the rural population, which again highlights the role that agriculture sector plays in transforming the livelihoods of communities in the country. About between 70 and 80% of Kenya agricultural produce is from small-scale farmers. And again, this highlights the role that small-scale farmers play in feeding the people in Kenya and beyond. And that apart from staple crops that are produced by our farmers, of course, we have crops that are meant for export, which are tea, coffee, horticultural products, fruits, and oil crops. And of course, the sector still faces a lot of challenges, and some of these are attributed to the effects of climate change, like we are experiencing adverse weather conditions, low and unpredictable rainfall patterns, and of course, pests and diseases on the increase. And then looking at the issues of market access, this remains a very big challenge in the country, mainly due to logistical challenges, and the other side, of course, the policy limitations that we have. And then, of course, we have issues of low productivity, and of course, this is why the government is promoting or is moving or encouraging farmers to move towards industrial form of agriculture. Next, please. And this brings us to the conversation about the pesticide use in Kenya. And according to statistics, of course, We have almost 100% of Kenya's farmers that are using pesticides. And again, this can be attributed to the government push for increased productivity through excessive use of agrochemicals. And looking at the crops that require, or the crops that are grown in Kenya that require highest volumes of pesticides, we have, of course, maize, which is our staple. We have wheat, coffee, potatoes, and of course, tomatoes that are relying a lot on highly hazardous pesticides. So according to a research that was conducted by the Root for Food initiative, it was revealed that out of 230 active ingredients registered by the Kenyan Pest Control and Produce Board, only 134 are approved in Europe, 19 are not listed in the EU database, and 77 have been restricted due to chronic health effects, environmental persistence, and of course, toxicity to fish, high toxicity to fish and bees. In the country, we have 171 companies that have pesticides that are registered in the country, like companies that are dealing with the pesticides. And of course, China is leading with 342, followed by Europe with 253 companies. And this means that Europe has a lot of control in the pesticide industry in the country. So last month, the Kenya government banned over 50 pesticide products as part of the broader effort to promote safer and more sustainable agricultural practices. But the challenge we have is that these products have not been disclosed to the public. So we are still fighting with the government so that it can disclose the pesticides that were banned in the country. Next, please. So I have given some examples of some of the active ingredients that are banned in Europe but are still used in Kenya that include paraquat, which is highly toxic. So these are some of the examples that of the ingredients that are still used in Kenya, but they are banned in Europe. The reason as to why this trade on hazardous pesticides continue is because, of course, of exporters' rights, and I think that Marta has alluded to that. And then, of course, the loopholes that we have in the EU and Kenya legislations. And in Kenya, of course, the policies that we have are skewed in favor of industrial model of agriculture because the government is pushing farmers to mechanize and to increase the use of agrochemicals because they believe that by doing so, of course, will increase agricultural productivity in the country. And then it is important to note that highly hazardous pesticides are banned in high-income countries that have robust regulatory and enforcement programs, but are sold to Kenya and other low and middle-income countries. And it's also important to note that while active ingredients not approved under the Plant Protection Product regulation cannot be marketed within the EU, these products can still be manufactured and exported to countries with weaker regulations like Kenya and other low-income countries. Next, please. So in terms of the effects of pesticides used in Kenya, of course, we have acute health effects such as skin irritations, headaches, and nausea, and other difficulties that we are facing as a country. Then, of course, we also have long-term health effects like neurological damage, hormonal disruption, cancers, and increased birth defects. And to give an example of cancer, of course, you talk about cancer as a foreign disease, but cancer today is the third biggest killer in the country. And the rise in cancer cases has been attributed to how we are producing our food. And of course, that is much related to the pesticides that we are applying in our farms. And then, of course, we have soil and water contamination, which I think is you are very familiar with. And then on the other side, we have loss of biodiversity. And I think that as a country, we are losing a lot of biodiversity resources, of course, based on the agricultural practices that we are employing in our farms. And then on the other side, of course, the level of chemicals that we are using in our farms. And then we have export rejections. And I think that, again, Marta alluded to this because we are importing a lot of toxic chemicals from EU and other countries, but we are not allowed to export those chemicals back. And the reason as to why we have a lot of rejections is because, of course, we are using a lot of pesticides, but sometimes our farmers are abusing these chemicals because they don't know how to use or the safe way of using these agrochemicals. So we are actually trying to address through different channels, working with the government at different levels to ensure that, of course, our farmers are being educated on the toxicity, on the toxic use of these agrochemicals. Next, please. So in terms of how MIRA measures can address dumping of pesticides and trade injustices, of course, MIRA measures can lead to export ban of EU prohibited pesticides to non-EU countries, that is Kenya and other countries, and then ban imports of food grown with high hazardous pesticides unless exporting countries applies the same standards as those in the EU. And then we need to address policies that allow dumping of food products from highly subsidized farmers in the global north that are flooding the African market, seriously affecting the local farmers. Because we realize that some of these products are cheaper than the products that are offered in the local market. So we need to address these policies and ensure that, of course, our farmers have a competitive advantage. And then on the other side, we need to align trade with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, meaning that the EU actions in the Global South should be based on sustainable investments, not only investing for profit, but ensuring that, of course, whatever investment that is being brought to Kenya and other developing countries, of course, sustainable investments, and of course, not investments that are being done at the expense of suffering majority of suffering farmers. Next, please.
Okay, John, I'd ask you if you can wrap up in just half a minute, if that's possible.
Okay, I'm wrapping up actually, sorry. Yeah, so in terms of the role that Slow Food Kenya or Slow Food Africa can play, of course, we need to raise awareness on the EU double standards that allow the export of highly hazardous pesticides. And then we also need to raise awareness on the harmful effects of agrochemicals through training on pesticide safety, events, and media campaigns. We also need to promote agroecological practices like making biopesticides, push and pull technology for fighting pesticides, and then, of course, participating in policy processes and pushing for people and planet-centered policies that support agroecological practices to protect our people, ecosystems, in the future. This should be done at local, regional, national, and continental level. And of course, we need to work with our global partners to ensure that we are also addressing policies at EU and other levels. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that, John. Beautifully wrapped up at the end. Thank you. And thank you for bringing that perspective. I do think when we're speaking about this, mirror measures, I think we talk more from this side about unfair competition for EU farmers rather than the impact on the ground. So it's really valuable to bring that perspective. Thank you for that. I've seen quite a few questions in the chat for you, and there's a lot of interest being generated about this. We'll get to that later on, but for now, let me ask you a question. So when it comes to the idea of banning the export of banned pesticides, it's something I've worked on quite a lot in Brussels. When it comes to that kind of mirror measure, there's a few points I hear all the time in Brussels, and one of which is that it's unfair to push EU standards on other countries, on sovereign countries, that it's paternalistic to take the decision for others. And I just wanted to put that to you and ask what you would say to that point, because that's something we hear a lot in Brussels.
Yeah, I know that, of course, that's a conversation that we have had even before. And I think that, of course, we're not actually trying to push for mirror measures. It's not like trying to impose things on other countries. But I think that whatever that doesn't work in Europe should not, or whatever is banned in Europe should not be exported in other countries. Because if you believe that some of these toxic pesticides are harmful to your people, to environment, also to the animals, why should you export the same to other countries? So it's not about like imposing things, but ensuring that, of course, we are taking care of our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world. And of course, these toxic chemicals have a lot of impacts on the environment, on our health, and also animal welfare. So I think it's not imposing, but of course, ensuring that we are taking care of our brothers and sisters all over the world.
Very clear message. Thank you for that, John. And like I say, we've taken note of the questions that are coming in on the chat, and John's not going anywhere. He can answer those later. Thank you very much. And I would now like to pass the floor to our next speaker, and that is Nick Jacobs, who is Consulting Director for the think tank IPES-Food. For those of you that don't know, that stands for the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems. So Nick's going to talk to us about territorial markets and local action as a solution to balance power in trade and break down why global commodity markets offer a flawed recipe for food security. So Nick, let me pass you the floor.
Thanks very much, Natasha. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. I see my slides are being loaded. Thanks very much, Alice. So I'll be presenting some of the findings from a report that IPES-Food published last year called Food from Somewhere. And this is a report that really tries to look at food security in a different way. And the question I'll be asking today actually is, how are people really fed? And be looking at the role of these local and territorial markets in delivering food security around the world, contrary to some of the received wisdom we hear about global commodity markets and global trade. So if we could move to the next slide. I just want to start with a couple of assumptions that guide our thinking on trade and food security. So first of all, we're told that global food trade is reliable and shockproof. We're also told that global markets, global trade is efficient, and this is the best way to get cheap food to people or affordable food to people. And we're not just told that this is a way to feed people, but we're regularly told that this is the only path to food security in the world we live in. I've just got, one quote here to exemplify this kind of thinking. It's from the Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization. Nothing against him personally. This is the kind of quote you'll hear from people all across global institutions and governments. It reads, trade and trade policies have a central role to play to help reverse hunger. The first simple reason for this is that while some world regions are net food exporters, others are importers, meaning food must be able to circulate freely from regions with surpluses to those with deficits. So this is the classic free market thinking, comparative advantage view that we've been hearing for decades. And these assumptions are really what guide policy making today on trade. It's because of these assumptions that we have policies all across the board in Europe and other world regions that are really skewed in favor of exports, skewed in favor of global commodity markets, skewed in favor of mass retail versus local chains that don't serve global commodity markets. So it's very important to start, I think, by understanding those assumptions. And clearly, these are assumptions that were already pretty questionable before we came to this recent crisis moment. But I think now, after the supply shocks that we've seen recurrently over recent years, it's become even more difficult to justify this view. So I'd like to try and unpack some of these misconceptions about trade and about food security. Particularly, I would like to talk about the role of local territorial markets in actually getting food to people. So if we move to the next slide, first of all, just to very briefly explain what we mean by territorial markets. These are essentially markets and supply chains that are largely outside of corporate global value chains, generally shorter chains with smallholders, cooperatives, small-scale vendors and processors in a prominent position. And these are markets that are rooted in communities and territories, that they're not necessarily hyper-local. In some cases, these might be operating on a national, regional scale, but these are markets that are rooted in quite different values and goals and objectives to the global commodity chains and long value chains run by multinational agribusinesses. So as you can see here, there are many very familiar food marketing options here: public markets, farmers markets, informal markets and street vending, also community supported agriculture, various forms of direct sales, urban agriculture. Critically, these are many parts of the food system that are essentially ignored when we talk about the serious business of food security and resilience, and yet they're really critical. So if we move to the next slide, First of all, one of the myths about trade is that this is the only way to get food to people, and that trade is the main route to food security. The reality around the world is that most food does not cross international borders. The figure is hard to determine, but most studies put the figure around 20 to 30% of the food that's consumed has actually crossed an international border. And if you look at it in nutrition terms, nutrients, it's an even lower figure, which is dependent on international trade. Also crucial to note that about 80% of urban food demand is actually supplied within a 500-kilometer radius. So that could be within the national border or slightly beyond. And what this means is that most people are actually fed by local and territorial supply chains and markets, where food isn't crossing international borders and is not controlled by corporate value chains. And first of all, these markets are making a huge contribution to food security because they are making food accessible and affordable, especially for low-income populations. So, for example, in our report, we surveyed a huge quantity of literature on this topic, and there's a number of studies showing that actually public market pricing is more affordable, negotiable, and cheaper than supermarkets in general. A study in Africa found that supermarket prices were 25% higher for fruits and vegetables compared to the average prices on local markets. Local territorial markets have also been more resistant to inflation. So a recent study in Canada during the post-pandemic years showed that for 9 out of 10 foods, food price inflation was higher in grocery stores and supermarkets than it was on farmers markets. Another reason that these markets are so crucial in getting food to people is that they are simply better suited to the needs and preferences of low-income populations and marginalized groups. So that's because many public markets and street markets will be located in or near to low-income neighborhoods. It's because people can go to these markets and secure small, flexible quantities of food. Price bargaining, informal credit arrangements are possible. And essentially, these markets are often described as a kind of niche, but we're talking here about 2.5 billion people eat street foods every day. We're talking about 400 markets in a city like Dhaka in Bangladesh that feed more than 25 million people today, and where 95% of the city's urban poor purchase their food. So this is really the backbone of food systems in many parts of the world, and it's really the way that low-income communities get access to fresh, nutritious food. If we move to the next slide.
Just to say, you've got about one more minute.
Perfect. I'll wrap up. And the next slide, another myth is that global trade and commodity markets is the cheapest and most efficient way to get food to people, and that these are shock-proof, reliable systems. What we saw through the pandemic is really the opposite. We saw empty shelves and spoilage in global supply chains. We saw huge problems in terms of pollinators that have to be shipped from one part of the world to another in over complex global chains, and huge price spikes in global commodity markets following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. By contrast, local markets, despite unfavorable policies and despite market shutdowns in many parts of the world, were able to keep people fed through the pandemic, often providing really critical emergency responses. In Brazil, for example, 45% of the emergency food supply initiatives during the COVID pandemic were based on local supply chains, many of those agroecological. And of course, urban agriculture is a key buffer in these moments as well. So if we skip now to, we can skip over the next slide, and I will conclude on this one. Thank you. So the essential conclusion here is that we need to rethink trade, markets, and food security. We're told that global food chains and commodity markets are how people are fed. This is not the case for the majority of the world population, and in fact, sometimes these chains undermine food security. By contrast, territorial markets are making a huge contribution to feeding people, and often they're facing obstacles in the shape of policies that are skewed towards industrial agriculture, global commodity systems, global markets, and we go into a lot more detail on that in the report. And based on that, our key recommendation is that strengthening territorial markets is the best route to food security. We need trade in addition to local markets, but what we don't need is this ongoing policy bias towards trade and towards exports. And thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Nick. And I think that the report has been or will be linked in the chat if you'd like to look more into that, into the IPES-Food report. But before I turn to our next speaker, Nick, let me just put a quick question to you. Well, quick question. Let's see. You spoke obviously a lot. I mean, it was fascinating. Some amazing numbers there that you were like, how you're unpicking this idea that food security is not based on this global trade. We're looking at the global level. You spoke about action at the very, very local level. But in terms of the EU level, perhaps you could also speak to exactly what you would like to see coming out of this level of things to support local development, local infrastructure, what your main message would be there to the EU side of things and how much that can help push these territorial markets.
Yeah, I think Marta already spoke a lot about the trade policies, and that's certainly a key priority. So I won't talk about that, but I mean, there's so much that can be done at a European level to support the development of local territorial food chains. Part of it is funding the right infrastructures. So around the world, you often see public markets, local markets functioning without basic sanitation, without basic infrastructures. And a lot of the development funding and infrastructure funding is really focused on big supply routes, ports, getting food onto global markets. So quite simply, that funding needs to be redirected to supporting local chains. And ultimately, these markets and supply chains are underpinned by small-scale producers, cooperatives, etc. And so anything that can be done to support them, to support transition to sustainable agroecological production models, to provide training and logistical support so these farmers can individually or collectively bring their food to market and find these local markets. That's really the key. And I think one of the main contributions the EU can make to protect farmers from food price volatility.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Some really concrete suggestions. Thank you. And I can see also there are plenty of questions coming in the chat for you as well, Nick, so don't go anywhere. But we'll now pass to our next speaker, and last but not least, of course, we have Björn Scherhorn, who is a farmer from Germany. He's going to give us a flavour of the EU farmers' perspective on double standards allowed by the current trade rules. And I will just say that Björn will speak in German. So you can, if you need to, you can change the interpretation. You can find the button at the end of your screen. There's also the instructions in the chat. If you have any problems, just let us know there. But let me pass to Björn. Björn, can you give us a bit of an introduction to your farm? What do you produce? Where do you sell it? And how are there imported products that really directly compete with you? How do you feel this on your side with you and your work?
Ja, hallo, ich bin Björn Scherhorn. Ich bin mittlerweile Biolandwirt in Nordwestniedersachsen,
the northwest of Germany. We have a farm that has been run by our family for over 700 years. And in 2016, we switched our...
Vraiment beaucoup de générations. Et donc là, j'ai commencé à la produire.
Poco a poco nos hemos dado cuenta de que en realidad...
Was mir zu seiner Zeit noch nicht aufgefallen ist, das ist der Faktor, dass meine Milchkühe auf die Weide gehören. Wir haben damals 11.000 Liter Milch pro Kuh und Jahr gehabt und heutzutage haben wir irgendwie 5.500 bis 6.000 Liter und die Kälber trinken noch bei den Kühen. Also wir machen muttergebundene Kälberaufzucht in Vollweidehaltung heutzutage, produzieren Käse und Milch für die Molkerei, haben eine Fleischdirektvermarktung und ein bisschen Getreideanbau eben für lokale Bäcker. In meiner konventionellen Wirtschaftsweise habe ich gelernt, wie ich möglichst viel Agrarrohstoff produziere. Und diesen Agrarrohstoff, der wird immer bemessen an der Martief-Weizenbörse beziehungsweise an der Getreidebörse. Und exakt da ist auch das, was wir global feststellen. Und das ist das, was wir eben lokal genauso feststellen. Ich habe hier im Radius von 1,5 Kilometern 18 Berufskollegen in den letzten 20 Jahren verloren. Und es gestaltet sich so, dass wir in Deutschland in den letzten, von 1990 bis 2023 die Anzahl der landwirtschaftlichen Betriebe auf die Hälfte reduziert haben. Angefangen hat es richtig drastisch in den 90er Jahren, als der BSI-Skandal aufkam. Erstens ist in Deutschland die Mauer gefallen zwischen Ost und West, was den östlichen Teil mehr zu Agrarmärkten geöffnet hat, um mehr Rohstoffe zu produzieren. Und auf der anderen Seite haben wir eben mit dem BSI-Skandal ein tierisches Eiweiß in Deutschland oder auch in der EU verboten bekommen. Und darüber brauchte man dann plötzlich tierisches Eiweiß für die Massenproduktion oder Massenfleischproduktion. Und das wiederum hat dafür gesorgt, dass überhaupt erst Agrarmärkte erschlossen werden konnten oder Märkte bedient werden konnten auf dem globalen Markt, die mit uns überhaupt gar nicht konkurrieren können, wenn wir jetzt an die Agrarchemie und dergleichen denken. Die uns in den 90ern verboten wurde, oder meinem Vater in dem Fall, ist heutzutage immer noch in Südamerika im vollen Einsatz und wird weiterhin hier produziert. Aber, und da beißt sich dann wieder der Fuchs in den Schwanz, wir haben die Situation, dass eben die Agrargüter eben mit Ausbringen der Agrarchemie immer noch hier verfüttert werden dürfen. Meiner Meinung nach müsste das Zurückfüttern von tierischen Eiweißen auf deutlich, deutlich weniger Schweine und Hühner wieder zugelassen werden, damit eben ein Einsatz von pflanzlichen Eiweißen als Futter überhaupt gar nicht sinnvoll ist. Andererseits müssten die Standards, und da sind wir beim Thema Doppelstandards, auf Lebensqualität gesetzt werden. Wir beobachten, dass immer mehr Landwirte in Deutschland zumindest an Burnout, Depressionen und auch Selbstmordgedanken leiden, weil sie eben nicht an den globalen Märkten agieren können und weil sie nicht selber über die Preise bestimmen können. Wir haben eine Situation, in der die Landwirte auch hier mittlerweile eine anerkannte Berufskrankheit haben, nämlich Parkinson, aufgrund dieser Gifte, die sie in Übermaß eingesetzt haben. Und wenn wir hier schon eine anerkannte Berufskrankheit wie Parkinson haben, dann stelle ich mir die Frage, was passiert global? Wir müssen es hier mittlerweile als Landwirte, als Bauern bezahlen in der landwirtschaftlichen Krankenkasse. Aber die Konzerne, die diese Mittel uns versprochen haben als Heilsbringer, müssen den Wahnsinn nicht bezahlen. Was ich für mich feststelle, ist, dass der Unterschied zwischen Nahrungsmittel, das kam heute auch, der Unterschied zwischen Nahrungsmittel und Lebensmittel extrem groß ist. Nahrungsmittel sind Füllstoffe für den Magen, in Anführungsstrichen, die global an einer Marti-Weizenbörse verhandelt, gehandelt und verschoben werden können. Und eben auch als Zahlungsmittel für hiesige Exportgüter, Agrarchemie, Autoteile und dergleichen eingesetzt werden können. Und Lebensmittel schenken lokal Lebensqualität. Und diese Lebensqualität, dahin müssen wir zurück und gleichzeitig zu dem bäuerlichen Ursprungsgedanken und Lebensqualität im Lebensmittel, die unser aller Leben verlängert. Wir haben global das Problem, dass wir in den Gesundheitssystemen stetige Überlastung haben. Und diese Überlastung können wir nur abfangen mit exklusiv hochwertigen Lebensmitteln. Gleichzeitig klang ja eben das Thema Artenvielfalt an. Und das ist auch hier zu bemerken.
Moment.
Okay. Also, ich plädiere dafür, dass man lokal denkt und global handelt. Es gibt immer Güter, die weltweit gehandelt werden müssen. Thema Kaffee oder Südfrüchte oder irgendwas dergleichen. Aber wir dürfen nicht als Bauern, als Landwirte auf dem einen...
But as farmers, we have to make sure that we do not have a negative impact on the global south. So,
und mit großem Bewusstsein für den Endkunden, den Endkonsumenten, dass auch wieder eine Artenvielfalt, eine Lebensqualität und ein Lebensqualitätsbooster in einer Win-Win in Mehrfachsituation wieder bodenständig wird. Ja.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Björn. I'll just put one question to you before we throw out questions from the audience, and that's also a little warning for everyone watching. If you've got questions, to be ready to put your hand up. But Björn, perhaps I can push you a little bit more on this last point, which is more about really what you would look for in terms of support or protective measures that you'd like to see from the German side or from the EU side in terms of supporting sustainable smaller farms like yours.
Es verhält sich ja folgendermaßen. Wenn ich hier Handelskriterien oder Herstellungskriterien habe, wenn ich hier Menschenrechte habe, wenn ich hier Lohnbedingungen habe, wenn ich hier Schutz von Artenvielfalt habe, wenn ich hier die unterschiedlichsten vielfältigen Auflagen habe, dann erwarte ich, dass anderswo auf der Welt mindestens dasselbe eingehalten werden kann. Das heißt, dass die Menschen, die dort vor Ort produzieren, nicht unter schlechteren Bedingungen produzieren müssen, als wie ich es hier tue. Ich beschwere mich schon über schlechte Preise und wenig Marktteilnahme. Aber wenn mein Produkt anderswo produziert wird, wird es noch anonymer und den Menschen geht es noch schlechter, als es hier vor Ort eingehalten werden kann. Also Doppelstandards müssen zu allgemeinen Standards werden, die allgemeine Lebensqualität steigern und nicht verschlechtern.
Excellent. Thank you for that very clear message there to end on. Thank you, Björn. So I will now throw out to the audience for your questions. So just a reminder that if you'd like to ask a question, you can raise your hand. I will see that and then pass you the floor. We also have a few questions in the chat, but I will prioritize firstly the questions, hands being raised. Does anybody have any questions for our speakers? I don't think I can see. Can you see? Ah, yes. Okay. All right. I can't see any just yet. Okay, I have a hand from Neil Kamal. If you could just quickly introduce yourself and say the media you work for and say who your question is directed to. Neil, you can put your video and then you can unmute yourself, hopefully.
I have already typed my question in the chat box, actually.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah. What you can write over there.
Okay, would you like to put the question yourself or would you like me to read it?
Yeah, I have already mentioned over there.
Okay. All right.
I get it again there.
Okay, I will find your question in the chat then. Anybody else like to put the question, raise your hand and put our question to one of our speakers before I move to the questions in the chat? Just flick through the pages. No, I think we're okay. Oh, we have one question from Busani Bafana. Busani, let me pass you the floor. Can you put your video as well when you ask your question and just say who it is you're reporting for?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. My question really relates to, given that John spoke about the high incidence of chemicals that farmers have access to in Kenya. I'm wondering here, how do we then actually enforce like the Rotterdam Convention? If countries are still trading, these chemicals to the global south, as it were, yet these chemicals are so harmful. What policy changes need to happen here so that we could actually stop this destruction?
Great, thank you for that question, John, pass you the floor.
Yeah, I think, okay, thank you so
Also
much.
meiner Meinung nach brauchen wir eine klare Aufklärung für den Endkunden,
Björn,
für den Endkonsumenten, was er an Leben...
One moment, sorry, Björn.
Okay. So.
Okay, hang on.
Hört ihr mich?
One person at a time. We're going to go to John first, and then
Meinung
if you want to come in on this point, you can come in afterwards. Okay, John, pass you the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And I think that the first thing that we need to do is to raise a lot of awareness to ensure that, of course, our consumers, our farmers are aware about some of these toxic chemicals, because, of course, the level of awareness is very low. So we need to do a lot of awareness creation through radio, through the media, through events, to ensure that, of course, our farmers are aware. And then on the other side, I think that we need to lobby and support farmers to participate in policy processes, because you know that most of the policies that we have in Kenya and many African countries, of course, are made in boardrooms. Of course, we have a lot of influence from multinationals, and it's very important that, of course, our farmers and consumers are allowed to participate in some of these key policy processes and decisions that are made that affect their lives. So we need to work towards that. And I think that in Kenya as a country, of course, we are working with the governments at different levels, at county level and also at regional and national level. And of course, we are participating in the development of agroecology policies. And these are policies that will guide the investment in agroecology and, of course, in sustainable food systems in different parts of the country. So I think that awareness and, of course, lobbying for policy changes is fundamental.
Great. Thank you for that, John. Björn, did you want to come in on this point? And as a reminder, Björn will speak in German, so if you need interpretation, to switch it now.
Ja. Ich schließe mich John absolut an. Und ich denke, es müsste deutlich einfacher für die Landwirte oder Bauern sein. Bauern-Landwirt ist für mich ein entscheidender Unterschied. Der Bauer denkt in Generationen, der Landwirt produziert den anonymen Rohstoff. Aber der entscheidende Punkt ist, es müsste einfacher sein, Agrarstrukturen zu schaffen, wo Bauern viel einfacher die ökologische Landwirtschaft leben können, anstatt eben die konventionelle mit Herbiziden, Fungiziden, Insektiziden. Aktuell ist es so, bei mir gerade aktuell der Fall, ich werde viel mehr kontrolliert als Biobetrieb, als wie ein konventioneller Betrieb kontrolliert wird, der riesige Massen produziert. Alleine meine Vielfalt sorgt schon für mehr Kontrollen. Und das ist natürlich eigentlich eine Diskrepanz, die so nicht richtig sein kann.
All right. Thank you very much for that. Any other hands going up before I move to the questions in the chat? Don't think I see any, but I'm happy to flick around. Yeah, Arthur. Arthur Obamas from Context.
Yes. Hi. Thank you very much for the floor, Natasha, and thank you for this very interesting exchange. I have a question, I guess, for Marta Messa about the European Commission announced a few weeks ago that it will work on a list of pesticides that they would like to that are already banned in the EU, and they would like to also ban the imports of food products treated with these substances. Do you think that it is a good way to tackle this issue, to have this kind of list? And do you already plan to work with the European Commission on this matter? And if so, what do you expect from DG Agri on that? Thank you.
Yes, Marta.
Thank you so much for the question. It's certainly a first step, because this is actually also something that civil society had been asking for a long time: ban the export of pesticides that are banned in the EU. So it's a first step. We are really eager to see the Commission follow through on this. We'll certainly, let me say, do our work to make sure that this happens also within the framework of the work we're doing with the Commission, whether it's in the European Board of Agriculture and Food or other consultative spaces. But yeah, it's the first thing. Then again, it's really about also, making sure that besides doing that, we also do the homework. The European Union also does the homework anyways of doing what Björn was saying and John was saying, also to not input products that have pesticides that are maybe coming from other countries, like the slides of John were pointing at China being one of the big exporters to Kenya of pesticides. Also, those should not come into Europe.
Great. I hope that answered your question, Arthur, or do you want to follow up on that?
No, that's great. Thank you.
Good. Excellent. Great. I think I will, as I don't see any more hands, I'm going to move to a few of the questions we've had coming through in the chat. And there's one here I think that would be best addressed to you, Nick. So I'm not sure of the name, I just have the question, I'm afraid. But so the question is that there's a question of affordability of good local food, and that many people have to choose to buy or have to buy the cheapest option, and they spoke here in the question, they said they have to buy what is the cheapest in the local supermarket. So what can they do? Perhaps you can speak to that point about the affordability question there.
Yeah, thanks. There's a few points here. I think, first of all, the idea that food is cheaper in the supermarket is sometimes true, but it's sometimes also a perception. And it can be difficult to compare. And you also have very different pricing models. Like, for example, community-supported agriculture schemes and veg boxes. Those tend to be quite affordable, but they require consumers to make an upfront investment and to provide farmers with income in advance to cover the production costs that they'll face. So it's a completely different, set of prices. In other cases, yeah, certainly in some European contexts, the prices will be cheaper still in supermarkets. That's partly as a result of the subsidization of industrial commodity production. It's partly the exploitative conditions within those chains that unfortunately means that the food is sold below the real costs of production at prices that don't reflect the true costs. And I think for me that just really reinforces how important it is to take steps politically to make sure that the true costs are reflected in the foods that are sold. And in any case, there will still be populations who will struggle with very low incomes, who will struggle to buy the most affordable foods on local markets. And that's why in our report we put a lot of emphasis on the need for social policies, food vouchers, various measures that kind of links social policies to these local markets and make sure that everybody does have access to healthy, nutritious foods.
Great, thank you very much for that. I hope that answers speaks to that question. I see there was a few more questions on Kenya, but I see that John, you've answered those in the chat, so thank you for doing that. If anyone has any follow-ups on that, do let me know. But otherwise, I will pass to another question, which is a bit broader maybe than just trade, was on the common agricultural policy, which of course is in the ecosystem, does affect the subsidization of food for export. So it is relative in that sense. Not sure who will be best placed to answer this, perhaps Marta, but the question involves the farmers' protests in the EU, and the fact that maybe some of these policies and the cap are seen as detrimental to the livelihoods, environmental standards, the tensions there, the perception of the burden of the environmental standards. And I think the question really is talking a little bit to, can you talk a bit from that side of things and look at the common agricultural policy and how this fits into this kind of conversation and whether it's fit for purpose?
Thank you so much. And then maybe I'm already inviting Björn if he wants to chime in as a European farmer that is with experiencing that on the ground. So the common agricultural policy is the most funded EU policy in the EU. It uses to date 1/3 of the European budget. I'm saying to date because this summer on the 16th of July, the European Commission will present its new so-called multi-annual financial framework, so the budget for the next cycle. And of course, it influences heavily both through funding, but also through the mechanisms that it puts in place the direction of European agriculture. I'll start by saying one thing. We, as Slow Food, so of course, many farmers are involved in our movement, like Björn, and many of them do not even apply to the funding related to the common agricultural policy. either because it's too expensive, it's too cumbersome in terms of bureaucracy, especially if you're a small-scale farmer working on your own or in a small farm, or because it's not really what they need to be able to do their job, and they'd rather have established healthy relationships with the people who buy their products, whether it's restaurants, consumers, local markets, and so on. So when it comes to the protests, we were here in Brussels when they happened. They had tractors literally lined up in the street below the window in front of me and in many other streets. And I went with my colleagues, and I think I met you, Natasha, there as well, to the square in front of the parliament where the protest happened. And basically every 5 meters, or not even, there was a different national group of farmers association. And each national group had a very, very different message. So if you listen to the farmers from Italy, they were talking about lab-grown meat. If you were listening to the Flemish farmers, they were talking about other issues. If you were listening to the Polish farmers, they were worried about the imports from Ukraine. If we were talking to the French and to the Spanish, it was more about the exchange of products within Spain and France. So the messages were very different. And also, Via Campesina was also there and had messages much closer to the kind of conversation we're having here today. What came through in the news, and here it's great to have this group of journalists participating in this, was one version of the story. And that was basically the loudest voice that came through, which was that of the biggest farming representatives that are really like defending the status quo. And that we're saying, yes, the message they were hammering is the environmental regulations are strangling us, it's not possible. This is not to say that there is certainly room for improvement in terms of improving, simplifying the bureaucracy, maintaining the fact that anyways, the common agricultural policy is taxpayers' money. So it's public money. So we still need to know how it is spent. Like, it's normal. So there is certainly room for improvement to make it, to have it transparent and accessible, but without overburdening the farmers. But long story short, the protests were about many, many things. The story that came through was just a simplified version of it. But the sad thing about it is that that is the one that then led to the policy change that we saw happen very, very quickly in terms of dismantling many of the environmental measures related to the common agricultural policy in Europe. Having said that, now we're discussing the new reform. We are working on that as well as Slow Food with many other organizations. We'll have to see what can be improved. But yeah, this is my reaction to the question on the protests and what they were about.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Marta. And yes, Björn, would you like to come in on this point, on this question?
Ja, sehr gerne. Also in meiner Wahrnehmung war es so, dass wir zumindest jetzt auf deutscher Ebene eine geballte Version an unterschiedlichen Emotionen hatten, die dafür gesorgt haben, dass viele vermeintlich an einem Strang ziehen, aber am Ende hat es dann doch wieder den eigentlichen Nutznießern des Strukturbruchs oder Strukturwandels gedient. Und das darf man nicht vergessen. Also da sind ganz viele Landwirte als Bauern auf der Straße gewesen mit oftmals fremdfinanzierten Schleppern und deren Ehefrauen, die sind zu Hause gewesen und haben den Hof geschmissen. Deren Schwestern, deren Mütter etc. pp. Und ich habe in meinem Umfeld beobachtet, dass dort einfach kein Gehör mehr stattfindet aus der Wahrnehmung der landwirtschaftlichen Betriebe und Betriebsleiter. Und wir haben eine EU-Agrarpolitik, weil wir global Handel betreiben und daraus entstehen eben auch Steuereinnahmen, daraus entstehen Gelder. Und auf der anderen Seite hängen wir Landwirte, wir bäuerlichen Familienbetriebe relativ nah am Tropf. Und dieser Tropf, wenn der irgendwie unterbrochen wird, sorgt der für einen extremen Bruch in der Landwirtschaft. Und die Betriebe, die wirklich von morgens bis abends am Arbeiten sind, die haben Probleme, die ganze Bürokratie zu stemmen. Ich habe eben schon kurz angerissen, ich habe in diesem Jahr alleine, weil ich häufiger mal die Klappe aufmache, 8 Vor-Ort-Kontrollen. Das muss man erstmal leisten können. Und wenn man dann auf dem Sektor Demonstrationen unterwegs ist und dann Gleichgesinnte findet, dann sind viele unterschiedliche Emotionen, die sich dann kundtun und breit machen. Aber die Hoffnung in der Landwirtschaft, dass sich was verändert, ist extrem gering. Meiner Meinung nach geht es nur mit dem Endkunden, dem Endkonsumenten und den Bauern gemeinsam, um positiv was zu verändern. Denn die großen Nutznießer profitieren egal wie. Egal wer auf Demonstrationen fährt oder egal wer irgendwo in Anführungsstrichen den Lauten auf einer Protestbühne macht.
Thank you very much for bringing your perspective in on that point. And now we're very nearly at the end of our session. I'm going to have to bring this to a close. So thank you to everyone for joining. Thank you to all of the speakers. Just a few points to add. Like I said at the beginning, if you'd like the recording, you can ask the organisers and they will send that your way. I would also like to point out that everything, the new slow food position paper, all the policy briefs, reports, and the presentations that you've seen today have been handily put together in one place in a Google Drive for you to make your life easier. The Slow Food team are sharing the link, I think now, or have shared it in the chat. I'd also like to finish off by flagging that Brussels will soon host the very first edition of Terra Madre Europe, starting this weekend on the 22nd and running to the 24th. This will bring together a mix of all kinds of flavors of farmers and food artisans, cooks, policymakers, activists from across Europe for 3 days of discussions, interactive workshops, and communal meals. Björn spoke about the lack of hope in the farming community right now. Maybe this can be a moment to inspire a little bit of hope, a little bit of action, give some food for thought and food for your belly. So definitely not to be missed. And I'd love to see you there for those of you who are in Brussels. So with that, I'd like to bring this workshop to a close. So thank you again to all of our speakers today. Thank you to our interpreters for your tireless work there in the background, helping us very much. Thank you for that. Thank you to all of you for joining us, and I hope it was useful to your work. Of course, if you have any further questions, don't hesitate to reach out to the Slow Food team. I'm sure they'll be more than happy to answer them. So that's all from my side. It's been a pleasure to moderate this session, and I wish you all an excellent afternoon, evening, and rest of your week. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
You're welcome.